In Stalin's worldview, decisions were determined by objective factors, not personal relationships. Thus, the goodwill of wartime alliance was subjective and superseded by the new circumstances of victory. The goal of Soviet strategy would be to achieve the maximum security for the inevitable showdown. This meant pushing the security borders of Russia as far west as possible and weakening the countries beyond these security borders through communist parties and covert operations. While the war was going on, Western leaders resisted acknowledging assessments of this kind. Churchill, because of his need to stay in step with America. Roosevelt, because he was advocating a master plan to secure a just and lasting peace, which was in effect a reversal of what had been the European international order. He would countenance neither a balance of power nor a restoration of empires. His public program called for rules for the peaceful resolution of disputes and parallel efforts of the major powers, the so-called four policemen: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China. The United States and the Soviet Union especially were expected to take the lead in checking violations of peace. Charles Bolin, then a young Foreign Service officer working as Roosevelt's Russian language translator and later an architect of the Cold War U.S. policy relationship, faulted Roosevelt's American conviction that the other fellow is a good guy who will respond properly and decently if you treat him right. He, Roosevelt, felt that Stalin viewed the world somewhat in the same light as he did, and that Stalin's hostility and distrust were due to the neglect that Soviet Russia had suffered at the hands of other countries for years after the revolution. What he did not understand was that Stalin's enmity was based on profound ideological convictions. Another view holds that Roosevelt, who had demonstrated his subtlety in the often ruthless way in which he maneuvered the essentially neutralist American people toward a war that few contemporaries considered necessary, was beyond being deceived by a leader even as wily as Stalin. According to this interpretation, Roosevelt was biding his time and humoring the Soviet leader to keep him from making a separate deal with Hitler. He must have known, or would soon discover, that the Soviet view of world order was antithetical to the American one. Invocations of democracy and self-determination would serve to rally the American public, but must eventually prove unacceptable to Moscow. Once Germany's unconditional surrender had been achieved and Soviet intransigence had been demonstrated, according to this view, Roosevelt would have rallied the democracies with the same determination he had shown in opposition to Hitler. Great leaders often embody great ambiguities. When he was assassinated, was President John F. Kennedy on the verge of expanding America's commitment to Vietnam or withdrawing from it? Naivete was not, generally speaking, a charge Roosevelt's critics made against him. Probably the answer is that Roosevelt, like his people, was ambivalent about the two sides of international order. He hoped for a peace based on legitimacy, that is, trust between individuals, respect for international law, humanitarian objectives, and goodwill. But confronted with the Soviet Union's insistently power-based approach, he would likely have reverted to the Machiavellian side that had brought him to leadership and made him the dominant figure of his period. The question of what balance he would have struck was preempted by his death in the fourth month of his fourth presidential term, before his design for dealing with the Soviet Union could be completed. Harry S. Truman, excluded by Roosevelt from any decision-making, was suddenly catapulted into that role.